Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to yet another episode of All Things Policy. I'm Lakshmi. Our guest is Smita Murthy. Sowmya and I will have a conversation with Smita Murthy regarding food safety and quality. Smita Murthy is a microbiologist and runs a cool cafe in Pune called the Fat Labrador Cafe. Over to you, Smita, and welcome to this All Things Policy episode. To start with, what motivated you to choose this field?
Hi, Lakshmi, and I'm really happy to be here. Like you said, I'm a microbiologist by education, and though I started my career in research, life happens, and somehow I landed up starting to work with Coca-Cola. Their first production facility when they entered India was in my city in Pune, and I applied to join them as a microbiologist, and it so happened that I started working with them in microbiology at their plant, at the production facility, and then got on to other fields, got on to food safety, because when you think about food safety, microbiology was one of the pillars that you look at, and quality management systems. So eventually, my role expanded from just being a microbiologist to looking at food safety and quality, and that's how my journey to food safety started. And that's what I've been doing for the last 20 odd years now, working on food safety, really.
That's good to know. And also, there is a lot of rigor surrounding food businesses in India. But from a policy perspective, how does regulation keep up with the pace of restaurant businesses that are springing up?
So it's just not restaurant business, but the entire food processing and food business in general. Uh, if you look at India and a little bit of its journey, we used to have different regulations. There used to be milk standards regulated by one body. There used to be APIDA for something else. There used to be a fruit produce PFA. It used to be called. So every kind of food system or a food product was regulated by different rules and regulations. And it was not until I think almost 2006 that we got one unified standard. So in 2006, FSSAI, the Indian regulator, came about, and they did away with all these piecemeal regulations in different fields, and everything was brought under, one umbrella. So that was a way forward. And since then, FSSAI has been the one regulator for food, everything food, whether it's processed food, milk, dairy, fruit juices, whatever, restaurants, hygiene, anything that to do with food, it's come under FSSAI now. So that's a way forward. But you talk about this in every thing we do in Takshashila, in every when you start doing a course on GCPP, it is state capacity, it is limited, and the same applies to food regulations as well. We are much better than we were before 2006. So a lot of rationalization has happened with food regulations. There is some scientific rigor coming into looking at setting up specifications and regulatory requirements for different kinds of food. But still, there is a long way to go. We are now in a space where it's not just restaurants, any food. There's 3D printing of food. There are new combinations, food that you import from elsewhere, which is something that we've never eaten grown up. So all these things are still, you need to look at them and find solutions for it. We are not 100% there, but much better than we were before. And we are on that journey now. But yeah, there's still a lot that has to be done.
But Smita, just an extension to that part of regulation, right? Is it too stiff when it comes to, small players? We see people with little carts selling idlis here, doing small pani puri stuff, all of that. So how do you extend this regulation to a larger audience? Does that really happen?
There has been some work on this. I can't say there's totally nothing happening in our country. There's an Eat Right movement that has been happening, and a lot of organizations from CII to Fixie to all these people are trying to do capability building and working with small food vendors, trying to help them with the basics of food safety. Not 100%, but there is awareness. And I think if you ask me about regulations, the food safety is food safety. I mean, if it is food, it has to be safe. So there is no question whether you're selling pani puri or whether it's a fancy five-star restaurant. The food has to be safe. And as India, we've accepted this that thele wale ke paas pani puri you eat. I mean, his hands are going to go in, the water is going to be bad, and we are like immune to it, which we are probably to a certain extent. But it doesn't mean that there shouldn't be safe practices going there. So there is a lot of work happening around this. Food handlers, like vendors on the street, are being trained at least with the basics, that at least wash your hands before you're going to dip it into your pani puri jar, basic stuff like that, which is happening. And I think
Right.
it's just the basics which we really need and we should remember when we talk about food safety. It's not really rocket science in that sense. It is science, but it's something that smaller steps will also help, so yeah.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Smita.
And also, with the post Russia Ukraine war, India too has placed a ban on rice exports following the war. So, do you have any thoughts on why, on a multilateral level, food is being weaponized?
Again, this is something that goes back to whatever I studied with GCPP, and I think all of us agree that bans are not the way for anything. It never really helps in any positive way, and there are plenty of unintended consequences that come from it. Food should not be weaponized, is true, but again, every country also needs to take care of its own food security also. So there are these two things that you have to balance. You need food security and, I mean, not weaponize it, but as we know, banning anything is not going to help in any way. So, while saying that, I think in India, what we also need to look at is ways in which we can prevent food loss and waste. When we talk about food security, one thing is food being safe to eat, and the other part is the losses that we incur. Our post harvest is really not there. We've started coming up with cold chains right now, but a lot of food gets wasted and, you know, it's just thrown away. So basically, it's not just about weaponizing and stopping and banning rice exports or whatever. It's also looking at how we can prevent food loss and waste post harvest in our own country. So we don't have to resort to banning food being sent somewhere else. We'd rather not waste so much that, that we do have surpluses already. And if you look at the newspaper articles, you'll find that food is eaten away by rats and then just thrown away. So while we are saying we'll ban it because we want that food security, we are also wasting a lot of food. So I think there are different ways in which you'll need to look at it, not just banning something to be exported, when you can also look at reducing losses.
Yeah, I like how Smita, being a prompt Takshashila student, has told us that putting a ban on something is not really going to help anybody, anyways. It's going to probably hurt the system further.
It hurts the farmers for sure. I think it's not only just rice exports. Anytime and it's like, it happens in a knee jerk basis. You ban something today and then tomorrow you say, okay, I'll let you export some percentage, or it, I think, hurts the poorest farmers the most. So uh, I don't think there's anything rational in the way that policy works.
Right.
Also, with an exploding population in India, with so much of food wastage, how could we better the warehousing capacity? And can governments think of adopting zero hunger?
Okay, the first part of your question first. In terms of warehousing, I think now there are a lot of policies and incentives that are being given to people to, establish good warehousing facilities. Good cold chain initiatives are coming up. I think there's a huge push for making the cold chains available across the country. And you do see some progress there. You can see a lot of cold storage for different kinds of food coming up. So if you travel around Guntur, which is our chili belt, you see suddenly, like couple of years ago, there were no cold chains, but now you find a lot of cold storages that are coming up in the growing belt for chili storage. So, when the prices go up, then you kind of get your stuff out from the cold chain and make a little profit on it. So there is this thing happening across the country with different food products. The warehousing and cold storages are coming up, and I think there are a lot of incentives and policies that the government is make this cold store and warehouse happen. Of course, again, going back to the policies, there will be some unintended consequences of it, something that could have worked better. But yeah, overall, if I say there is some positive direction that warehousing and cold storages are taking. Talking about zero hunger, I think it is something we need to aspire to. It's not impossible. There is a lot of food waste, a lot of food spoilage that happens post harvest. When I say post harvest, that is as soon as it gets out of the farm gate. A lot of it gets wasted. Even in our farm practices, a lot of pest attacks or just spoilage, or you just there's unseasonal rain and climatic variations now, which is even worse with climate change. It does lead to a lot of food waste. So aspiring to zero hunger, I think, should be something we do. It's not impossible to do. Already, the way things are, if we could have managed the food loss better in storage and warehousing and transportation, a lot of people could have been fed with it. So to say it simply, zero hunger is something that we should aspire to, and it's not totally impossible. I mean, you can always talk about the quality of food and nutritional value, but hunger and that are separated. Zero hunger is something that we can, I think, start thinking about. Yeah. I mean, we are not still there, but it's not an impossible dream to have.
Okay, that was insightful, Smita. And also, talking of nutrition, many a time we see people eating street food and falling sick. And post COVID, there has been many such cases. Recently, we did have a few deaths in schools because of contamination of food. So, may I know if there are food labs and health safety officers do a regular check on nutrition, especially in schools?
Um, so I think India runs one of the biggest midday meal schemes. There are problems with the scheme, like it's not perfect, but we do have a midday meal scheme. A lot of the bigger players in this who run the midday meal scheme, they do a the basic testing for food safety. It is done. There are labs across the country. The quality of labs is another question. But yes, we do have food testing labs spread across the country. So when you're talking about things like eating from a street food vendor, there are basic things that have to be followed. Like clean water, basic washing of your hands. If you're using fresh produce, how do you what temperature do you keep it at? If you're reheating it, what temperature is that reheat being done? So there are a few checks and balances which I think with training the food vendors, it's happening. But there's a lot of food labs also that are coming up. There is also a government giving a lot of incentives to labs being set up. But running food labs is an expensive thing. You can do the base level of testing, like basic microbiology, to know that it doesn't have coliforms or E. coli in it that can make you sick. So those kind of testings are simple, and I think the regular labs can do it. But just given the sheer volume and scale of it, I'm not sure how effectively things get tested in a city like I run a cafe. We do have our FSSAI licenses. We do our own testing. It's not mandated for my cafe size, but we still get our water, ice, and our most vulnerable food, because we do some chicken. Chicken spoils faster than, say, a tomato or a potato, whatever. So we do test the most sensitive product once a year, but there is no rule like this, or there's nobody coming down on you and saying that you haven't tested this. When things go wrong, when it comes into a news media that somebody found a cockroach and a rat in their food or whatever, then everybody is suddenly doing too much testing, or every cafe or every restaurant gets tested. But there is nothing, again, comes back to state capacity. Probably there are rules and laws, but not that everybody follows them. But testing water and ice, I think, should be mandatory. It's not for a restaurant business, like a small restaurant business. Bigger restaurants do have to do that. So yeah, there are some things that are lacking, which we definitely should do. So I mean, yeah, it's not that you find a food inspector walking into your cafe unless things go wrong. But for food producing industries, food processing industries, there are rules, and there are like you have to send your samples out every 6 months, and it needs to get loaded on a government site called Foscos, I think it is. And so there are some rules and regulations coming up, but at the lowest level, it's voluntary, or if I don't send water and ice to test, nobody's going to ask me. But yeah, there is something that still needs to be done there.
Interesting, Smita. The education or just the willingness to understand it, right? What surprises me is I was in fact telling Lakshmi that when we were young, we used to go to the kirana store and pick up stuff,
Yeah.
and it used to not have an expiry date of sorts. And I don't think any of us cared about it too much. But today, I'm so finicky about making sure when I pick up grocery, I'm keeping a watch on these things. So, just wanted to get a sense of whether this whole thing of being paranoid versus getting grocery from a place which used to have like wholesale, right? Like they used to have
Yeah.
big gunny sacks of rice, and we picked up few kgs from there. So wanted to get a sense of what this should be, or what is a wise thing to do, Smita.
I think you are paranoid with that, Soumya. But in food, it's not expiry. It's something we used to call as best before date. There are some foods, of course, if let's say a frozen chicken, if you keep it at room temperature, it is going to get spoiled. It's not supposed to be
Hmm.
kept that way. But things like grocery, rice, sugar, dals,
Hmm.
buying it from that wholesale gunny sack, there is nothing that's going to happen to you, as long as it's the worst that would happen is probably you'll have some insects growing in it and some pests growing. I mean, you'll find small little kidas,
Yeah.
what you say, growing in
Right.
it. But
Yeah.
in food, it is
Yeah.
always best before date. So even if you drink a beverage, say a Coca-Cola, it has a BBD, it's a best before
Hmm.
date. It's never expiry. So your experience will
Hmm.
not be probably great. That freshness, the tingling taste on your tongue will not be there, but it doesn't make it unsafe. So it's
Hmm.
best before date for food. Medicines, of course, it's expiry date,
Hmm.
because with time and temperature, the chemicals or the
Correct.
uh, it
Hmm.
degrades. But if you say basic foods, a biscuit, rice, a beverage, all those don't they have best before date. So it's best to have it before that for the optimal taste experience, but doesn't mean you need to throw it away post that. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for easing this mind of mine a little more. Also, wanted to probably get a fair idea about ease of doing business in this whole landscape, right? I mean, a lot of things are tricky, and some of the businesses possibly don't even make it because the entry barriers are so strong, right, Smita? So, how is it in the food space and your own experience of having a cafe that you're running?
Um, for the cafe, like a cafe my size, like a small cafe, there are things that you need. You
Mhm.
need a fire license, you need a food license. Just to even start thinking of doing that, you have to get all these things in place, the FSSAI, the fire, shop act,
Hmm.
whatever.
Hmm.
It is getting better, but of course, as your restaurant grows bigger, or if you're serving alcohol with food, then it's a completely different game. Then it's the ease of doing business doesn't seem to be that easy. You have too many regulations, and sometimes they contradict each other. That happens in that space. For a smaller setup, yeah, you have to get a few licenses, but it is now becoming easier to do that. So for a small cafe like mine, getting a food license, we don't use any open burners in our, so getting a fire license, they are easier. But yes, it
Hmm.
is, you have to start 3 months in advance planning for it before you want to launch anything, at least to get the basics in place. That is there. For a food
Oh.
industry, I think it's much more different. There are thousands of schemes and PLI initiatives and all kinds of things that have come up for the food processing sector. And there, I think you need to have a dedicated team just doing this work to get all your licenses and everything in before you can even lay the foundation stone for your factory. So I was recently consulting on a new greenfield project, and it took us the best part of 2 years to basically get everything else in place before we started constructing the factory. So yeah, so there are some challenges, and it does take time.
Yeah.
Uh, but all in all,
Yeah.
from the people that I was working with on building the greenfield factory, their experience, it's
Mm-hmm.
getting a little better as time passes. It was much worse probably a few
Mm.
years ago. But yeah, it's not all there, and you can't just go to one person and say, "Okay, I want to set up a factory, so now help me." You still need to go to
Yeah.
10 different departments and do it. But it's getting better. That's all I can say.
Yeah. So true, because I know all of us here, all three of us know Bengaluru very well. And now, at the rate, every step we have, like a cafe or a coffee shop, the coffee culture in Bangalore is quite a bit, right? I mean, you've come for the
Yes.
coffee conference also, right, Smita?
Yeah.
So I think that and the breweries have taken off big time, at least in Bangalore. And I know that there's a good runway time for a brewery to get started, of course. Um, Smita, I wanted to also understand a little more on the supply chain complexities and like how does it operate in the global markets, especially given there's a lot of packaging that needs to happen, and of course these are processed or convenience foods that come in, right? So, how does that play out?
I'll talk in two parts. So when you're talking about a food business in India wanting to export, uh, just meeting FSSAI regulations is not enough. Then you need to meet
Hmm.
the regulations of the country that you're sending your stuff to. And
Hmm.
things get
Hmm.
complicated there because our labeling is completely different from theirs. So
Yeah.
now there are a lot of software and technology solutions that are available where you can put your ingredients, your recipe, and it'll kind of help you make a label for whichever country you export to. So that's one thing that's still a struggle, and it's still a developing field, and it's painful. Like sometimes if you're exporting to 30 countries, you need 30 different labels and 30 different packaging. So yes, that is still a challenge. Getting things into India, again, everything that comes into India has to have an FSSAI license. In India, we have some very peculiar things like the green dot for vegetarian and the red dot for
Yeah. Yeah.
non-veg,
Hmm.
which is not there in other parts of the
Hmm.
world. It's something specific to us. So when you're getting things into India, there are these challenges that we expect. Again, with our regulation, there are some foods
Yeah.
which are, we call them proprietary foods and some non-proprietary foods. So there are standards and specification for some, like a biscuit or a milk based product will have a specification because it's we know what that product is. But there are a lot of new products that get imported which don't fit into any of our categories in our regulation, because you've never probably had some dragon fruit
Hmm.
jelly, for example. I'm making it up, but traditionally we never
Hmm.
ate a
Hmm.
dragon fruit
Hmm.
jelly, and now somebody is getting this thing into our country. Then it's a struggle because you don't know under which clause, under which regulation, what do you test for, what do you put on it, because we don't have a
Hmm.
norm for
Hmm.
it. So then there are different ways that legislation approaches this, and then you'll have to make several rounds to figure out where I categorize this, what test reports do I give it, and then it does take time. It is very challenging for some food products. Like you see containers in, if you go to Navasheva or JNPT here, where the food is just thrown because they've imported it, but now it's not fitting into any category, or, what FSSAI is asking for, you don't have.
Oh
And
God. Hmm.
so that does keep happening. There's no easy answer for it right now, but like I said, technology and software is making it easier for just importing things into India or exporting things out, where it tells you regulations, law of the land, and whether this food will get approval or not. India also has some specific regulations on sweeteners. So some kind of sweeteners we don't allow.
Hmm. Hmm.
So there are
Oh,
all those things, little chemicals that go into your food, or one part like of the ingredient, stabilizer. You need to look at all that. So
yeah. Yeah.
it's a
Hmm.
muddy space, not too much clarity. But as more and more things keep
Yeah.
coming, you're kind of figuring it out. And if you're asking about global supply chains, I think there is no food which is really only made in Pune or only made in Bangalore, because everything that we add into our food now
mm,
comes from somewhere, like ascorbic acid. China is the
mm,
biggest
mm.
supplier worldwide. So you might have a made in India candy, but ascorbic acid will still come from China. So with the supply chain, the food safety space becomes really, really interesting. And a lot of
Right.
challenges come with that supply chain. So that's why you need global regulations like a codex, or at least where maybe they don't meet Indian laws. Maybe I don't meet European laws, which are more stringent, but there's at least an overriding thing, like the basic codex requirements are met. So managing supply
Mm,
chains in a food business becomes very, very intense, I can say, because you have to know, you have to ask for all these questions: that do you meet codex regulation? Can I have a test report? How do you formulate it? Colors, everything.
yeah.
There are some colors
Mm,
which are permitted, some which are not. So it's a
mm, mm.
yeah, it's a big thing with global food supply chains, and that's why food safety becomes so critical, actually, around the supply chains.
Yeah, but it's so hard then to think about how do you get a fine balance between, say, regulation, the markets, the competition there, right, Smita? Because you're always straddling between, of course,
Yeah.
in India, that's the irony, right? As you comply with one, at some point, you're not complying with something
Yes.
else because
Yes.
you
Correct.
you're compliant
Yeah.
with X, you're not
Correct.
compliant with Y. So,
So,
okay.
exactly like you said, this complying with X and Y, this was before 2006. It was just the norm, because every milk had a different standard, fruit products had a different, and you
Right.
met one, but I want to make, like, I want to convert milk to whey. I don't know which standard I have
Mm,
to follow, because then they are contradictory. But at least that part is
mm,
now sorted out in India. But for global
mm,
supply chains, I mean, there still are challenges, but big companies, or companies that, like, even spice producers who get cinnamon comes from Vietnam or Sri Lanka,
mm,
these things are now
mm,
getting sorted out, because now you have global supply chains which know they have to test to a particular standard. Like I said, the very basic, at least codex requirements everybody will meet. Then it kind
mm,
of becomes easier to say, okay, you've met codex, now can you do these five extra things because my country needs it. So that's where the
mm,
conversation is at. And yeah, it is happening slowly, and with some of the
mm.
common food products it's sorted out. With novel foods, as you come up, there are still things that you have to think of. And in food safety we have these strange, we have these ideas called food defense and food fraud. So that is something that
Yeah,
every food company now, when you tell them, they have to start thinking about food fraud. What is my most expensive ingredient? Saffron, for
yeah.
example. If I'm adding it
Mm,
into my spices, it's so expensive per gram that fraud can happen in that. So you have to start
yeah,
thinking like a criminal almost, that, what can go wrong in my saffron, and then start testing for those things when you import them or buy them. So that's something that
right.
is becoming more and more a standard. You're training people to think about the fraud that can happen. So you test material when it comes in for things that could go wrong. So, in fact, people keep looking at commodity prices or ingredient prices, and the most expensive one, you have to focus on it. I think that's one of the ways we work, that you find the most expensive ingredient and then start looking for things that can go wrong, added colors,
Mm,
uh,
mm.
s- like in saffron, you just don't put the kesar, you put another stamen that is red in color. So, all these things
Yeah,
you start doing for and testing. And our
yeah.
tests are becoming much, much better. Like, you can now go to gene level and really look at
Mm,
food frauds and things.
mm,
So,
mm, mm.
but yeah, still
Yeah,
it doesn't mean scandals don't happen. You have horse meat scandals and everything that happens. So I think it's
true,
going to be there
true.
as long as humans eat food. We're going to have fraud and stuff happening. So yeah.
Yeah. No, I was telling Lakshmi as well. Food is something that people will celebrate with on happy occasions, but it's not that we eat anything less if we are sad or something happens, right? So, food is, anyways, integral part of every story that you can possibly think of. But in terms of safety regulations, at least in the international context, like say a WHO kind of thing, do they influence the emerging markets, or do they kind of have any sort of role in our domestic policy making at all, Smita?
Like WHO and
Yeah,
Codex. So for
yeah.
food, the basic standards are Codex standards, and yes, that becomes the base, the foundation for every regulator in every country. Codex is what you develop your country standards based on. So it
Mm,
does play, and now if you look at FSSAI, the way they are setting standards for products. Codex definitely is the starting point, and then you get scientific data in, and you
mm,
get a bunch of scientists and companies working on that product before you set the regulation. So there is, and like WHO, even water, so at least the
mm.
basic drinking water guidelines from WHO is what becomes the base for you to develop your
Okay.
country standards.
Mm.
So yeah, they do have a lot of influence on how regulations are done. So
Okay. And
it's
the
it's the yeah
FSSAI,
yeah
it only regulates for food safety or even pricing?
it regulates for food safety, not for
Ah,
pricing.
okay.
Yeah,
Okay. Okay.
yeah.
Um, and is there a renewal process, Smita, to this, like every
Yes,
once a
yes.
year?
Yeah.
Okay.
So every so there are, I think, 3 years and 5 year licenses or 1 year licenses. And again with FSSAI, there is something that comes under state and something that comes under central. So depending on the how big your turnover is, you can apply for
Yeah.
a state or a central license. So yeah, there are those differences within
Okay.
FSSAI also. Yeah.
Interesting. More from a society angle, right? We have episodic flare-ups for food coloring, and then something as an ingredient not being okay for children, and all of that happens in a very episodic manner. So, are like citizen groups, or people who are looking at it not with the intent of, no, I'm not talking about the big brands having competition and trying to drag each other down, but I'm talking about, are there organizations or agencies which help ensure that we further this conversation rather than look at it from a perspective that it's very threatening, right? Of course, food coloring and all that, in Bangalore at least, the gobi manchurian today that you get has least of the redness in it, but more of a green thing with spring onions and all of that, and maintaining its natural texture and color. Smita, how has that been?
I think with Instagram and all this social media, a lot of awareness is coming. So if you look at all the recent episodes with on Bonvita not being a health drink or whatever, all these things so people have started looking at it, and I think as a people we are getting more conscious that tomato puree can't really be this red, or gobi manchurian
Yeah,
doesn't can't look orange almost. So I think that awareness is coming up with people, also putting it out on social media, and also the regulations are becoming tighter. And what has happened in the last 10 years is your equipment has become so good that you can now go down to parts per billion level. So earlier
mm,
it used to be parts per million, ppm level, or you no longer talk about milligrams and stuff like that.
mm,
That is
mm,
like ages ago.
mm,
From
mm.
ppm, from parts per million, you're going down to billion levels, so you can literally detect pesticides in ppb levels. So as detection is becoming more and more, it's possible to go to that level. We are also figuring out that my food has something that it shouldn't have. But
Right.
yeah, so there is activism on one side, where you put it all into the internet and to Instagram and whatever, and people get aware. And the other level where you're actually detecting at lower and lower levels, which is making it getting regulators to be more stringent. But of course, again, the problem comes with really going to the gobi manchurian guy on the street and testing his food for what there is. That
Yeah.
capacity we still don't have. I mean, it's not like everything sold on the road somebody's been able to take a sample and test it. So we still lack
Right.
that. Our regulations are good, but implementing
Yeah.
or testing for them still is something that we haven't been able to do to that level. Yeah.
Interesting. Thanks, Smita. I think we straddle between the Samaj, Sarkar, Bazaar, all segments of it. We know as customers or consumers, the role we play, right? I mean, little things that we can be aware of and also not finicky about. And also in terms of the regulation, though they, like you rightly put it across, that there is a body which allows for ensuring that we all consume safe food, there's a long trajectory for us to look at. And of course, the ease of doing business itself, and how the entirety of the market looks like, right? I mean, everybody loves to be in food business. You talk in Bangalore especially, I keep telling people that adjacent to any eating joint is next to gym, okay? So I'm
Yeah.
sure these these two thrive on, of course, I'm sure something is easy to get started, at least with these two things. But that's how it is, you eat and you go burn your calories at the gym, kind of
Yeah.
thing. And of course, binge on coffee, good coffee, and what a
Yeah.
variety and luxury that's become now.
That'll always
Uh,
be safe. Good,
yeah.
good,
Yeah.
good
Oh,
coffee.
thanks, Smita. Vouching by the coffee, of course. Right. So, and when coffee conference happened, I was like, okay, I mean, we are talking something now. There's a coffee conference happening, was something that I was like, okay, Bangalore is hosting it. So,
Yeah.
nice. So, it was a good conversation. Lakshmi, thanks for anchoring this whole thing and dragging Smita into it. We've delayed this podcast for the longest. We've been meaning to have this conversation for the longest. So, Smita, thanks for being on this episode, and we look forward to continuing our food conversations with probably different ideas coming in as topics as well. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Lakshmi. Thank you, Sowmya. Thanks a lot. This was lovely.
Thank you, Smita.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.